Hello everyone and welcome to Ginger Prime. My name's Brian if you're new around here, but if you're a returning subscriber, choo choo, bless you, cheese balls. If you, you should know what that means, but you are also looking scrumdiddlyumptious today. That's what you get for subscribing, by the way. Free compliments at the start of these videos. Today is Friday. We're actually filming this live. This is We Are Vana'diel. We're going to be talking about the latest updates and news, especially as it relates to this interview over on, wearevana'diel.com. Link will be in the description if you don't want my take on it. I'm hanging out here with chat. We're talking about Final Fantasy 11, especially as we enter into its 20th anniversary. I think it's going to be a really exciting time. So if you're interested, you can know, and you can come find me over here on Twitch on Fridays, where we stream regularly Monday through Friday. And Fridays, I take over, in which we play lots of variety games. Right now, focusing on leveling in Final Fantasy 14. We got some Lost Ark information coming up and more. So if you guys like MMORPGs, like hanging out with a pretty chill community, check us out, or just subscribe here at Ginger Prime, and either way, you'll get it in your feed, and we'll be good to go. All right, we discuss Vana'diel Special Edition, and I'm going to butcher names, and it's not on purpose. Maybe what we could do is I could just look up how to pronounce. Is there a right-click option? How to pronounce? Read aloud section.
Koichi Ishii.
Koichi Ishii. Oh, thank you, Internet. Let's see here. And you're probably going to hear me.
Yoshitaka Amon.
Yoshitaka Amon. Thank you so much.
Conversations between producer.
All right.
Series of conversations
How do I
between
stop?
Producer Matsui and special guests who are familiar with Final Fantasy 11.
Stop reading aloud. But that's cool. I didn't know. I was like, maybe. Anyway, so Koichi Ishii and Yoshitaka Amano. That's what we're doing, and this is part one. If you guys are interested in more of these style interviews, be sure to like that button. You know how it does. It helps out YouTube. Helps me also make sure that I understand fully exactly what's going on. But again, you can go have the internet, the computer read it to you if you want in that regards. So far, we discussed We Are Vana'diel, a series of conversations between producer Matsui and the special guests who are familiar with Final Fantasy 11. In this special edition, we bring you part two of the conversation between Koichi Ishii and the original director of Final Fantasy 11, Yoshitaka Amano, the illustrator behind numerous logos, illustrations, and characters of the Final Fantasy series. Since they were first acquainted 34 years ago with the first Final Fantasy, aka 1, the true one, not the Origins that's going to be dropping on us here soon, we asked them to share their behind-the-scenes stories of Final Fantasy stories overall, in addition to their memories of 11. In this first part of the conversation, Mr. Ishii and Mr. Amano talk about how they met and reveal their beginnings as creators, making this must-read for both Final Fantasy 11 players and fans of the Final Fantasy series in general. So, guys, I really hope you enjoy this. So, to differentiate between the two, and its first title, the same name, this is the article we're going to be referring to. The series title as Final Fantasy 1. All right, so Koichi Ishii is the CEO of Grezzo CEO Ltd, and in the early days of Square, he planned Final Fantasy 1 and is in charge of the game's design until the third game in the series. And after that, he worked in the direction of Sensen Desetu series. I love that series, but I cannot pronounce it for the life of me to this day. Projects before returning to the series' work in Final Fantasy 11. In addition to creating the foundation in the world of Vana'diel, he was also the director leading up to the Rise of Xilliard expansion. Yoshitaka Amano was the leading of illustrators in Japanese and the fantasy world, and an artist who's active in many fields, including stage art and costumes for films and plays. He began his career as the designer of Tasano production and later became an independent illustrator, and he has worked on illustrations and character designs for many Final Fantasy works, including novels and anime, and he has been involved with the series for over 34 years, from Final Fantasy 1 to the present. So, illustrations befitting Mr. Ishii's vision of Final Fantasy I almost said Final Fantasy 14. Whoa! And shout out, thank you so much, Phil, the meme, Filthy Meme, for that incredible amount of support while we're doing these videos. All right, although the discussion is about Final Fantasy 11, I'd like to begin with the topic of Final Fantasy 1, the first game you were both involved with. Ishii says, Final Fantasy 1's project began about 6 months after I joined Square, and they were formerly known as a part-timer, and there was a discussion in the company about dividing the development team. And we were about 4 teams in total, including one led by Mr. Sakaguchi and one led by Mr. Tanaka. Before I knew it, I was assigned to be part of Mr. Sakaguchi's team. Well, not that I had a choice, since I was just a part-timer at the time. When all time came for the team to convene, there were only about 4 of us then, and Mr. Sakaguchi proclaimed, "Our team is going to make an RPG like Dragon Quest. Ishii, you'll come up with a plan," and suddenly thrust me into a planning role. But after that, Mr. Sakaguchi and the others became busy with developing Highway Star. and almost completely abandoned us. Since the Sakaguchi team had only a few members, we were relocated to a warehouse that was divided into 2 rooms, which wasn't a flattering place to be. Mr. Sakaguchi and Miss Shibuya, Mr. Kasawa, and Nasir were all working on Highway Star in the back room. Meanwhile, I was all by myself in the front room, working on a makeshift cubicle formed from several floatable conference tables arranged in a U-shape. That's some interesting information. It's hard to imagine that the company we know now as Square Enix was such humble beginnings. How did you proceed with the project from there? I like games like Dragon Quest and The Legend of Zelda, so I started to work on planning out an RPG in my own way. I'd already envisioned some of the parts that later became the core of Final Fantasy I, such as the side view battles, a world with the 4 elements of fire, water, earth, and wind, and a diorama-like world map. As far as smaller details, for example, the thick window borders were inspired by the iron pipes in Mario Brothers, and the white glove pointing cursor was inspired by Crackout. I put all these ideas together one by one and also learned about pixel art on the side, which I printed out on numerous occasions to show Mr. Sakaguchi and ask him for his opinion. So Crackout is a block-breaking game by Konami, released on the NES in 1986. Really exciting. So, sounds like you were already thinking about getting and setting Final Fantasy I from the very early on. Can you tell me more about that? So Ishii says, back then, I wanted to create a fantasy world in digital form, and it was often drawing illustrations in my notebook. With Final Fantasy I-2, I planned to design a world where spirits and other supernatural beings felt close by. From that point, the visual images I had in mind were based on Mr. Amano's illustrations. At that time, the 3 illustrators whose styles were the closest to my ideals of fantasy were Rodney Matthews, Greg Hildebrandt, and Mr. Amano. In particular, I considered Mr. Amano to be a leading figure in the world of Japanese fantasy illustrations, to a point where I referenced Matten, and to further my imagination when working on projects for Square. That is why Mr. Amano was the first person to come to my mind when I thought about who I wanted to ask to illustrate the world of Final Fantasy I. So, your imagination was set on Mr. Amano from the beginning. Yes, I went to Mr. Sakaguchi and personally explained that Mr. Amano's art was perfect for Final Fantasy I, and at that point he didn't seem very convinced. But about a week later, it was Mr. Sakaguchi who approached me saying, Ishii, I found a great artist, what do you think? And then then he showed me the illustration, and it turned out to be Mr. Amano's work. I'm gonna make sure I move around in the game just a little bit so I don't end up getting kicked out of the game and kill the music. Yeah, doing it live. Let's go. All right. I imagine you had something to say about that. Absolutely. But it was I was happy that Mr. Sakaguchi showed interest in Mr. Amano and his work, even if it wasn't quite convinced when I'd recommend him. After obtaining Mr. Sakaguchi's consent, I said that he would visit Mr. Amano's office in Yokohama and make the request in person, and Miss Shibuya was to accompany him. Back then, Mr. Sakaguchi was driving a sports car, an RX-7, by the way. I sat in the passenger seat because I'm big, but the back seat was very narrow. Mrs. Shibuya had to sit almost completely sideways. But even in that state, all of us were bubbling with excitement on our way to Yokohama, eager to know if Mr. Amano would take our request. And when we asked Mr. Amano, he answered, "Sure, I'll do it," without even thinking twice. And I was really happy that when he said that, the 3 of us returned to our office relieved. Back then, you could say you saw Mr. Amano from the perspective of a fan rather than a game developer? I'd say so. I remember very well when Mr. Amano visited Square during the development of Final Fantasy I. Mr. Sakaguchi called the team together beforehand and warned us, "Mr. Amano is coming in today, but don't act like a groupie. Don't you dare beg for an autograph or anything like that." The other staff members listened immediately, but as soon as Mr. Amano arrived, I went straight to him with a copy of his art book, and I kept it on hand and asked him to sign it. When everyone else had ended up doing the same, and so began an autograph session. All for the little while Mr. Sakaguchi had a stern look on his face. That is freaking hilarious. That is freaking hilarious. I love that so much. You guys, oh wow, what fun. As a fan, like how could you not? Like how could you not sit down and do that? You know, as a fan, you couldn't pass up the opportunity. I mean, it's Mr. Amaro, you know. There's no way I would have listened. Or, well, and also I was about 22 at the time, so I really didn't listen to what people told me to do. By the way, what was your first encounter with Mr. Amano's work? I think it was in a bookstore. Many occasions I'd be walking around the store glancing at piles of novels and think, hey, that illustration seems kind of nice, and upon taking a closer look, it always turned out to be an illustration by Mr. Amano. I was particularly impressed by the illustrations of the Elric saga. And so this is a series of fantasy novels by Michael Moorcock. At the time, I just became an independent illustrator and was often working on cover illustrations for fantasy novels. But fantasy novels were a major genre back then, so I think Mr. Ishii is a really hardcore fan. So what did you think about Mr. Amano's art, Mr. Ishii? His illustrations eluded a sense of space in some shape or form. The other thing is that they, though their illustrations look beautiful at first glance, they are subtly filled with evil, looking behind beings with other dark imagery, and coexistence of beauty in this eerie was the line with which the Final Fantasy I had in mind. So Final Fantasy's genre is a challenge to create new designs. Mr. Amano, could you share your point of view on those days? At the time, I was in my early 30s and I was feeling limited by my job of design characters for animations, so I became an independent illustrator, and soon after that I received a commission for Final Fantasy I. In those days, Square wasn't well known as it is today, and Final Fantasy didn't even exist yet, so I'm curious to know how you came with to accept the job. Rather than being a matter of whether I recognized Square, I was still unsure what it'd be like to work for a video game. Back then, most people's perceptions of games were the tennis-type games that you hit a ball back and forth, or invader games, and very few of them had actual stories or music. Although I personally enjoyed playing games, I never imagined they'd become a part of my career, and I was very surprised when I first heard their proposal. Were there any factors that led to your decision? For me, at the time, Final Fantasy was a theme, and I wanted to draw that most. I honestly didn't know much about video games, but I wanted to try any job that led to fantasy. That's how motivated I felt about my fantasy work. What kinds of stance did you have at the time towards drawing fantasy illustrations? The basic premise is that Final Fantasy isn't a real world, and anything goes. Of course, there are many illustrators who reference weapons and armor from the Western medieval ages, but there also is a need to be faithful to reality. And there's no need for the reference material, and even if something abstract taken to the extreme, I think it's fine that if that's what the illustrator themselves considers to be fantasy. Modern fantasy, especially high fantasy, is a common image of swords and sorcery, but I see that you have no such reservations. As a matter of fact, the lack of restrictions is what appealed to me. When I was working in animation, I had to design characters based on historical research. For example, Time Boken is about going back in time and having adventures in various eras, and we had to design characters based off the historical research and each destination. By the way, checking the reference to make sure that there weren't any mistakes was more difficult than actually a process of drawing the illustrations. Now, at the time, I gained some reputation as an animator, but I felt that it was becoming a repetitive process, and I started to feel more and more tiring looking at references and wanted to design more freely. It's true that the characters of Time Boken, despite being arranged in bold ways, were designed to be either true or representative historical backgrounds. Amano says, on the other hand, Final Fantasy or fantasy didn't exist in reality to begin with, so there isn't a correct answer. And yet, if it's a fairy, for example, it's obvious that the motif is a butterfly for butterflies. I was also in charge of the character design for Machino Hutch, and so I had an image in my mind of the patterns of the wings. In other words, fantasy-related work gave me the freedom to create new designs based off knowledge and experience I'd accumulated over the years, and in and of itself was a big challenge for me and a lot of fun. In the case of the novels, for example, I was happy that my illustrations could help the readers imagine the scenes that they were reading. The illustrations for Elric Saga, which Mr. Ishii mentioned earlier, had a particularly strong response, and also I'd taken on some work for science fiction soon as I became an independent illustrator, but I had become more involved in fantasy after realizing it was the genre where I could express myself best. Machino Hutch, also known as The Adventures of Hutch in B in England, is the TV animated which aired between 1970 and 71, and the first possibility most well-known fairy tale anime by Tokusho Productions. So, Mr. Ishii returned to the topic of Final Fantasy I. What kind of illustrations did you request Amano to draw? At the time, the package illustrations for the NES game were almost designed to be popular among children, like those of Dragon Quest. So in that context, I wanted to differentiate the image from Final Fantasy I from that of other games, so I was told that I wanted to go with an overall mature look for the main character, which had several heads tall. Although I did explain the general setting of the game, like the 4 elements, I did tell him I wanted the scenario details and asked him to draw some concept at first. There were no restrictions at the time, so I was happy to have plenty of freedom to draw fantasy illustrations. And look how cool that guy, that's just phenomenal. Like, that is just gorgeous, right? All right. Yes, this is one of the first pictures I painted, and I pondered things like, is it okay to have the hero turned away? Or who are these figures supposed to be anyway? But drew whatever I wanted. It's truly wonderful illustration, and you looking at it now, I think it's also Mr. Sakaguchi's favorite too. I imagine it was a great pleasure to have Mr. Amano providing illustrations for the game you were designing, Mr. Ishii. Oh, obviously, but being before that, I felt blessed to be the first to see Mr. Amano's work, even if they were publishing in an art book. Not to mention, I got to see rough drawings before the finished product. Personally, I love the rough sketches that Mr. Amano draws. Each and every line that was penciled, it doesn't look wasted, and they convey the feeling of characters after images and fantastic atmosphere and energy. You can feel that the artist's thoughts in them, and it was fun to ponder things like, I wonder why this part of the draw was drawn with a thicker line. Rough sketches may not be complete as a piece of art, but they might have their own unique appeal. Perhaps it's different from person to person, but I could feel the emotions and themes in Mr. Amano's rough sketches. It was also fun to compare and the complete illustrations with their rough sketches to see how they had changed. I've worked with many different illustrators since then, and it's always fun to see the rough sketches. So for me, Mr. Amano is also a person who helped me discover a new way to enjoy illustrations. As you can see with the concept artwork collection Mr. Amano worked on, many of the monster designs. And then, yeah, we got the imps here. I love the imps from Final Fantasy 1. And what's going on, guys? Lord Nish, it's going good, dude. I'm having fun. We're making a video right now, and then we're gonna get back to some leveling. All right. Although the package illustration is the most prominent, the main role of illustrators for games back then was to instill an image of the player's mind, as if to say, this is how you should imagine the game. In that context, it was great for Mr. Amano also drew the monsters for Final Fantasy 1. As you play the game, monsters designed by Mr. Amano appear one after another, so the artwork from the package and the game depictions probably weren't all that different from each other. So this is true that the monsters in Final Fantasy 1 have a distinct Amano style and look to them, even though they're depicted in pixel art. I wonder how that's possible. And Ishii says, I think it's because the monsters have distinctive silhouettes. The NES had various limitations like restrictions with the number of colors, and even the original illustrations drew the eyes and mouths in such great detail. I couldn't fully express everything. Because of that, the silhouettes and poses are crucial in pixel art. Pixel art is designed with such concepts in mind and rules that resemble the original illustration, even if it is on the NES. And you can see examples of that work designed right there. This was where my background in animation came in handy. When it comes to animation, it's important to design characters with silhouettes that can be recognized even from a distance. I had that in mind when designing the monsters for Final Fantasy 1 and turned out to be suitable for pixel art too. Now, typically when designing dozens of monsters, and artists, the preference and tendencies tend to influence the silhouettes to be somewhat similar overall. But every monster Mr. Amano designed for Final Fantasy 1 is distinct, which I find amazing. However, I did have some hesitations when Mr. Amano drew monsters in frontal view. Final Fantasy 1's battles were displayed in profile view, so it felt odd to have monsters in frontal view, even if their illustrations and silhouettes looked good. And that being said, changing the perspective of monsters would ruin the silhouettes, so sometimes prove them anyway. So the package illustration that established Final Fantasy, right here. When it comes to illustrations of Final Fantasy 1, packaging is unforgettable. Compared to other NES games at the time, it was clearly different. That's freaking amazing. I drew this one towards the end of the Final Fantasy 1's development. With novels and other works, I draw the cover illustration first, so I remember being excited to finally work on the package illustration. I was floored when I saw this design for the Warrior Light. The armor is blue and the cloak is yellow, and they're accented a bits of red. Such color combination would normally be out of the question, but it was put together so beautifully here. And when with the framed image of the princess in the background, I found the neutral and faint colors to use to be very Mr. Amano. I think it was wonderful, especially like that when Mr. Amano uses the red color. It's vermilion, and the white background gives the illustration a clean and transparent feel. I'm sure many people saw this illustration and felt Final Fantasy had a mature coolness to it, which is, speaking of which, like when you look at Final Fantasy 16 on its way, having that first rated, actual M rated, like mainline at Final Fantasy game, not to count like the other M, like, but actually like Final Fantasy numbered M rated series. Like, I think that's really critical, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the long run. All right. Many people who owned an NES at the time might not have known about Mr. Amano. However, I believe the illustrations was able to leave an impression with people, and they saw it and went, oh, this art looks amazing. The package illustration was an important role in providing the first impression of the game. So when I saw the illustration, it reaffirmed my belief that asking Mr. Amano was the right decision. Mr. Amano, how did you feel when you finished Final Fantasy 1, your first video game project? Mr. Amano says, something that left a strong impression with me is something like momentum or talent or an energy to create a new era. And I felt that Mr. Ishii and everyone at Square, as they are formerly known, the energy provided me with powerful motivation to draw illustrations for Final Fantasy 1. And there was never a moment where I felt betrayed by that emotion, and I felt at the time. And for myself, working on Final Fantasy 1 gave me confidence in illustrating a fantasy world. So right after I finished working on 1, I was filled with a burning desire to take on all sorts of new challenges. So when I heard from Mr. Ishii that there was going to be a sequel to 1, I was excited to be able to take on new challenges. The illustrations for Final Fantasy 11 have slightly different atmosphere with them compared to these previous games, and I felt the bright colors were used overall. It says, or 2, excuse me. Oh, yes. When they were starting 2, Mr. Sakaguchi meant that we should go something for more pop, and I didn't really understand what he meant by pop, but my guess was that he wanted to make the imagery a little bit more accessible to general audiences. Since the Warrior Lights design in Final Fantasy 1 illustrated defined my expectations in a good way, I first consulted Mr. Amano about it. When Mr. Ishii told me about the concept of 2, and I had the empathy of using fluorescent colors, such as orange and yellow, and might give the game a different pop feeling compared to previous depictions in fantasy, I thought it would be a good fit for the Final Fantasy series, and felt that bringing it into being would be an interesting challenge for me as an illustrator. I think it was at the time Mr. Amano was also interested in modern art, and now I felt that this trend was inevitable. So what's your favorite illustration from 2, Mr. Ishii? I have to be the package illustration, of course. I had a feeling that Miss Shiba was the one who drew the rough draft for proposing the base illustration, but when I received Mr. Amano's illustration, I was dumbfounded. I saw the sharp-eyed youth with a sword at his side, and one was like, here it is. Although I tried to maintain a professional attitude as a game designer when interacting with Mr. Amano, I couldn't help but revert back to being a fan again whenever I saw these wonderful illustrations. Warrior Light says, Mr. Amano has been doing so many art styles in the new projects for Final Fantasy series, and by his art style also gives the Final Fantasy team many ideas. Their relationship is just phenomenal together. So I'd like to move on to the next topic of Final Fantasy 3. Oh, we're getting close to the end of the article, guys. All right, when Final Fantasy 3's project originally launched, it was working on Makatushi Saga development team, and Mr. Sakaguchi approached me to create the pixel art for each job in 3. I refused at first, but eventually I was worn down by and only accepted on the condition that I'd be allowed to do all the pixel art myself. And after all, the pixel art wouldn't have a sense of unity if it was made by multiple artists. So that reminds me, Mr. Amano's concept art for Monsters of 1 and 2 are black and white, and while they're in color for 3. The use of color drastically changes our impressions, doesn't it? Flipping through the illustrations at the time, I really liked the illustrations of Heian. Mr. Amano had a unique way of depicting skeletons in his drawings, and I would love to have some silver jewelry used as a motif. Also, if you look at the illustrations in chronological order, you can see that Mr. Amano's style changed a lot in a short period of time. Even though the Final Fantasy series was producing sequels in less than 2 years at that time, the changes of these illustrations are evident that Mr. Amano was taking on new challenges with us for each and every game. You're right, this changed quite a bit across all 3 games. Around that time, Mr. Amano also worked on cover illustrations for Guen Saga and Vampire Hunter D. I'd like to put a lot of those illustrations in chronological order too, and study how Mr. Amano evolved as an artist over time. So, guys, it looks like that is the end of this interview, and they're saying the second half of this, or the second half, is going to be available on January 26, 2022. So it should be hopefully a fun and adventurous time for us to explore the rest of this interview again. Guys, hopefully you enjoyed. I appreciate you hanging out with me in this video. Thanks for hanging out with me while I'm live filming this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed hearing it live as well. And now what I'll do is I'm going to dive into some Final Fantasy 14 White Mage. So anyway, guys, if you're here over on YouTube, I hope you appreciate it. Like, favorite, subscribe, share. Leave a comment about what your most interesting artwork from Amano is. I'd love to hear from you. But after that, all that being said and done, hopefully you have a fantastic day. Hopefully I'll see you in my next video. But until then, take care.
I just want to say I'm really glad you're feeling better, and I love the videos. Well, I love you too. Michelle? Shoot for the moon, and so even if you fail, you'll reach the stars. Go for the 100K subscribers. Yeah.